Hi, and welcome to Basketball Australia's Building Better Basketball podcast. And today I'm really happy to be joined by Peter Downs, who's the manager of Play by the Rules, Debbie Keirs, who's one of the senior managers at Basketball New South Wales, involved in both their officiating programs and also member protection and association work, and Jack Taylor, who is a FIBA badged and WNBL referee and has also worked very closely in a number of associations, including the ACT. So welcome, guys. Thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you.
Um, we're thankfully starting to emerge out of the enforced isolation that the COVID situation has put on us. It's a little different in every state and territory. WA and Northern Territory are already back and their competitions have started. Victoria thought they were going to be back next week, and now it's at least 6 weeks away. And so every state and territory is that little bit different. And we know the break has been challenging, not only because we haven't had the fun of going out and playing basketball and being involved in the sports that we love, but there's also, there's some hardship and anxiety that the isolation and this break is causing to people amongst our community. And I think we all need to have some empathy about that and some understanding, hopefully, of what that may impact upon in terms of behaviours when they do come back to their basketball communities. So, Pete, play by the rules. You're across all sports and nationally. What types of behaviours might we see coming back from this break?
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Michael, for inviting us and everything. What I thought I'd do is run through some of the bigger picture issues arising out of post COVID sport world. Just recently, Play by the Rules embarked on a series of what we called think tanks. We basically invited some guests from different aspects who talked about the impact of COVID-19 around community sport. And I just want to quote some of those and pull out some bits and pieces around that. It's not a full summary of what was covered. It was huge. All those videos are now on Play by the Rules. So I encourage people to have a look at those. There's some absolute gold in there. The first one was around importance of community connections, and we invited Dr. Bridie O'Donnell from the Office of Women in Sport there in Victoria, and Paul Kennedy from ABC News Breakfast, their sports journalist. And I just want to make a couple of quotes, which you'll see a theme coming through this, and please interrupt Jack and Debbie and Michael at any stage. There's a theme that emerges out of all of these. Bridie talked about, this is to quote Bridie, "This has been shocking in the true sense of the word, but let's capitalise on this renewed sense of connection amid the isolation. There's been an unprecedented level of communication and collaboration among CEOs and politicians, among clubs. This crisis has forced our hand in this regard and been helpful in this regard." And that was a kind of a theme that went through the other presentation think tanks as well, that out of all this, actually, there's been a level of collaboration inter-sport and intra-sport at different levels. And I found that too with Play by the Rules, which is I've never seen before. It's like we're this feeling that we're all in this together, so we all have to get out of this together type thing. We've got to work together. We don't have a choice. So some of the politics around that and some of the history was kind of forgotten in that. And I've owned up liaisons and collaborations that I've never seen before. And I think that's something, a real good lesson. And it was a theme that went through there. And that was a big topic from the first. So connect. And Paul Kennedy then talked about connections to your local community and your sponsors and keeping up those in times of isolation and things like that. The next one was around with Margot Foster around governance and planning for the future. So we had Margot in as an expert around governance. And to quote Margot, "At the heart of all this, every organisation needs to look after its culture and work together. It's not about you. There's no I in team. Put a focus on risk. Focus on your strategic plan. Do your SWOT analysis. Look at membership offerings and choices. People who will have less in the future." So you've got to look at how you offer memberships, how you offer those offerings. She said, "Don't judge a house by the number of bricks it's built with." So it's not all about the numbers, it's about your connection, your culture. And if at the governance level you don't talk about that, then you're really going to missing the point in many ways. about the impact of COVID. So she was very strong on boards and committees, really emphasising the importance of creating that culture, as well as all the logistical operational things as well.
Just on that, Pete, Deb, I know all of the state associations have been working with their local associations and governments in terms of getting everything ready to return to sport. As Pete said, it's been a real collaborative effort. How does that effort look like from Basketball New South Wales perspective?
I think one of the things that we've had to do, and I think a lot of entities have had to look outside the square and try and find different ways of connecting with the community. I'm sure every organisation has had their Zoom content increased by like quadruple. But we've all had to look at opportunities of how we're going to stay connected, give some education platforms, how we're going to rethink how we move forward if we want to put basketball back on the floor, and a lot of work around what is it going to look like. And it is a moving target, as everyone has been feeling quite challenged by it. But I think the fact that everybody's been communicating and looking a little bit more in minutiae of how they communicate so that we get more information out. Even for us, for our website, we had a daily update every day after we'd had a chat with the Office of Sport, any government departments, and then a meeting with our members like the presidents, and then we would communicate that on our website. And I think information was pretty key because everyone felt like they were in a bit of a vacuum and they wanted more information, and that creates a bit of challenge for people. They feel uncomfortable with not having, not knowing when they're going to go back and not knowing what they're going to do. And then when we did have some sort of light at the end of the tunnel for going back, then the challenge is how we are going to manage this. So we've had a lot of work around that as well with people.
Yeah. And some of that gets right down to registration periods and real minute detail that we have to think about doing it differently, as you said. So Pete, some other learnings from those think tanks?
Yeah, and I'll just pick up on what Deb was saying too, that in our Think Tank 4, it's a good segue, Deb, Professor Simone Fullerton from Griffith University, she talked about a lot around equity and emotional well-being and that, and to quote her, and Deb, you just reminded me to do this, if we only focus on managing the risk of disease, we face the risk of exacerbating inequities and potentially worsening emotional well-being. So again, it was a theme that went through, but Simone was particularly good at putting a focus on, in our rush to get back to playing and all the things that need to be done, which is understandable and a lot of pressure, there's a real risk of worsening emotional well-being. So the mental health issues, which are now coming to the fore in a little bit in the post, we're not over it yet, of course, but in the kind of post first shock of COVID, we're into that phase when people are considering the mental well-being and health of participants. There wasn't a lot throughout the think tanks around what can be done, because the feeling is that people are not experts in that area. So, what we did, we turned to people like Beyond Blue or the experts in that area. But I think it's a question of looking out for each other. We mentioned the other day, Michael, about the resources that Are You OK Day have just recently put out, which are very sport specific, very practical, and could be used by any sport, not just basketball, but any sport can use those resources. They're totally free, and it's just those little things, I think, that can make a difference. So there is help and assistance out there. The Hey Sport Are You OK, isn't it? Resources have just been released, and it's a direct response to what's been going on.
And we've got another one of our podcasts, which is looking at mental well-being. And one of our guests on that was saying how if you ask someone, are you okay? Even if they say, no, I'm fine, the fact that they've been asked in a genuine manner can have a positive impact on whatever's going on underneath their water. So the more we do show an interest and have a conversation or be open to having a conversation, the better off the people in our community will be. I think that's a really important point, and it is something that we've seen happen during this period. I think there's more awareness of mental well-being. Jack, it's something I know in refereeing communities, there's been various things, step challenges and all sorts of things to engage the referees who can't go out and blow a whistle. Can you tell us about some of those?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's you're right. How do you keep the sense of community when you're not physically there all the time? And one of the great examples you're talking about is exactly that: the step challenges, the kilometre challenges, and even connecting all the different levels. I know we did one in New South Wales, and you had an international referee who's been to World Championships, competing and working alongside a kid who's just started their elite journey. I mean, that connection in itself is an example of they probably may never have had their paths crossed before. Now all of a sudden they're either competing in a team or against another team. It really brings that bond strong, but it also, in emphasis, helps them to see what's coming in the future and how cool this may be for them. But absolutely, it's those little things. That's ticking mental health. That's ticking connection. That's ticking being physically ready for when we do come back. All of those in one little exercise. And even then you just sit back and you look at the numbers and you go, my goodness, look what we can achieve together. Look what we can culturally build. Look how we can connect all these things, building on what, yourself, Deb, and Pete have already said. It's a great example of that.
And I think we'll certainly come back to building a culture when we talk later in the podcast about how we manage our conflict. Pete, what else was coming out of those think tanks?
Yeah, well, I'll jump to think tank 5, which was around the Return to Sport toolkit that's been put out by Sport Australia there. So we had Kate Corkery and Ian Roy on the line. There was a number of issues. They went through the toolkit, which I'm sure people can find very easily on Sport Australia and Play by the Rules there. A couple of the issues that came out of that was the role and the responsibility of the COVID safety coordinator type position. I don't know if Basketball Australia are doing that or where they're positioned.
We certainly are. All the states and territories have specific return to sport guidelines, and that role of a biosafety officer or a biosecurity officer or just a community safety officer. I've seen a few different names for them. But that role is front and centre in terms of getting associations back safely to sport.
Yeah, okay. Well, there were a couple of questions that came up during that think tank. One was about who's suitable for that role, and the other one was about liability in that role. What if an outbreak breaks out? Who's liable? Now, I don't want to pretend to answer that. I'm not a legal expert, but there's a very good article on Play by the Rules on the homepage that talks exactly about the legal liability of COVID safety coordinators. So I encourage people to have a look at that. Who's suitable? Well, the answer to that was more, it's who puts their hand up. There may be people in the club with a kind of background that's suitable for that in terms of biosecurity and things like that. But it's essentially, it could be the trainer, sports trainer, it could be an MPIO. There was a bit of a conversation around the role of MPIOs and COVID safety because that potentially falls within the complaints area as well and all that kind of thing. So there was no definitive answer. One thing they did say is you're only going to get one shot at this. If you're going to go for the safety coordinator and do this, then go full on with it. Don't go half measure because you potentially will miss something out. So the key message from Ian, which I really liked, was if you're going to do that, just go full on, use the whole checklist, use the safety coordinator role, support them, promote their position, work with them in the committee level as well. So I thought that was really good, strong advice because that's what's needed really.
And certainly in Tasmania and Western Australia, where they've been up and running now in various forms, those roles have been really well received by the people. And part of that is probably because we see them when we go to Bunnings, we see them when we go to the supermarket. There's someone there that's filling a role. And one of the skills, and again, we addressed this in a podcast specifically on the safety officers, one of the skills we think they need to have is the ability to smile and say hello and have a conversation with someone. It's not a role that's stopping people being involved. It's just a role that's, making people informed about what we have to do as a sport to return safely. A big part of that is just being personable and again, having conversations with people about it.
Might deflect to Deb there as well, because the role of the MPIO came up in that context and says, because they're probably the most well-known, often the case, they could be the most well-known or trusted source that people are likely to go to before a safety coordinator, perhaps? And that sort of came up as a question.
We think that a lot of our associations have selected people who either fall into an MPIO role or a normal supervisor role because they're used to dealing with their community, so their community feels comfortable going and saying something to them. We start back for our seniors in another week's time, so it'll be interesting to see how we go. But I know some associations have gone back domestically already, and they've put, you know, some quite good processes in place. And from some of the people that we're working with that we know do their biosecurity officer, or whatever one word, they do have a skill set of working with people and dealing with people, because we believe that some people are going to be so excited to come back to basketball that, you know, anything's going to be okay and there's going to be no problem. But then a few weeks down the track, if there's you know, it could be a bit more challenging because, you know, the more people think that there shouldn't be restrictions as we progress, then they could challenge some of those steps that are in place. So people, you know, good communicators are pretty key in that area.
And one of the learnings we had from Darwin basketball, who were the first to come back, and they were changing things almost daily in terms of some of their processes, how they move people in and out and stuff as they learned. So it is, as COVID has been the whole way through, it's a really fluid situation, and that can cause people anxiety and uncertainty. We don't like those things, and we often do have an adverse reaction. So the people skills, for want of a better description, that those safety officers have are going to be really important, I think. Pete, anything else in the think tanks?
Yeah, a couple of them. 6 and 7, we had think tanks around child safety and one around domestic violence and violence against women. So the child safety, we have Professor Daryl Higgins and Douglas Russell from the Institute of Child Protection Studies, and Brooke Irving from gymnastics as well, talking around some of the issues there. And there were similarities here between Paddy Kinsley talking about domestic violence and violence against women. There's been studies already coming out of Monash and some bigger ones in the UK, looking at the impact of the unfortunate impact of increase in domestic violence against women during lockdown. And Daryl and Douglas talked about predators in child abuse and child safety means, and that they do target crisis situations, of which we're in a crisis situation. So they talked again, which is similar to what I mentioned earlier, really about this boils down to culture and equity, and that's at the root of all these kind of things. So to ignore that now in the rush to get back to playing is actually increasing the vulnerability for these sorts of things to occur. So that was a really strong theme that came out in those two in particular, because the root of that is around gender equity and culture. And so to help those that are most vulnerable, or the situations that may occur, is if you're working on culture and you're working on equity, then you are addressing these things there, but don't ignore them in the rush to get back or the logistics of getting back. So it was a very, very strong message, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I think a very pertinent message for all of us. Deb, I'm going to throw at you a really specific example that could happen in a basketball association and is happening in my daughter's school at the moment. And they've been back now for many weeks. But the school is getting a lot of contact from parents along the lines of, you know, little Johnny coughed in class, why didn't you send them home? You're not looking after the health and safety of my child. There is clearly a heightened sensitivity to coughing and sneezing. Even if you're in the supermarket and someone coughs or sneezes, you can see everyone, you know, turn and look. So in a basketball, in a game, someone coughs in a key and another player has a reaction and says, well, that person has to be sent home. You know, I need to be protected. How do we go about addressing that situation and diffusing it? I
think one of the things we have is, if we've got signs, obviously we're saying to people, please don't come if you're unwell. Guaranteed, if you can't cough is when you need to cough. I find that myself. That people are still going to have hay fever and people people are still going to have, croaky voices and coughs. But if we're doing our steps and measures where people come in and we're generally thinking they're well, and then they go on the court, what we've suggested to our officials, because we don't think the officials should be in a position where they have to determine if somebody can continue to play. However, we do need to acknowledge that someone has a concern. So what we're recommending is that they then go and speak to the biosecurity person that's on for that day, so they can have a more detailed private discussion with the person. So, the person could have some other issue that they might be prepared to share with that biosecurity person that makes it clear that they're not necessarily a risk. Or they may have a conversation that shows that they probably shouldn't have been there, and they might choose to, take an option to discontinue playing or go home. But it's a very sensitive issue, and you can't discount people's concerns. But I believe it needs to be controlled by the person that we've appointed, or the club or the association's appointed to that kind of role, because not everybody that's a good official is necessarily able to deal with something like this. This is a little bit outside the scope of what we would normally expect on court. And I think that people might be more inclined to share it with the person who has those good skills and that generally has a bit of a background either in member protection or dealing with people, and that to have that discussion. Short of being a doctor and being able to test them, there's not much else I think you can actually do unless someone's really obviously unwell. And then our recommendation is always to be on the probably a little bit more conservative in our approach, and then ask that they stay home until they've obviously had seen somebody, a medical professional.
Sure, no, there's some great tips there. And I know with my own club here in Canberra, we're just at practice stage at the moment. We haven't started competitions yet, and we're still having attendance records as you come in, and on that attendance record is, have you experienced, feeling unwell, etc. in the past? Have you, been in contact with anyone? So those questions are front and centre in people's minds. And again, that's part of the role of the safety officer as people are coming in to just touch base with them and see how they are. But Jack, managing behaviour is not just a COVID thing. Managing behaviour has been around since Naismith invented the game, perhaps. And I don't think we should just think about it in terms of COVID, but what the break might have given us is a chance for some reflection, a chance for us to look and think about the culture that we want to have, and how we can set about creating those cultures. So what are some things some basketball associations can do, not so much to manage conflict, but hopefully to avoid conflict in the first place?
Yeah, it's a good question, and you're absolutely right. I think, the first thing I'd say in this space is similar to what you've said already, but in simpler language is COVID is not an excuse for poor behaviour. And I think that's the first thing that people, I would recommend in association land is if someone is behaving poorly, don't allow COVID to be the excuse. But having said that, understand the context that it creates for you. The first thing I would be doing is I'd be asking them, are you okay? Particularly if it's somebody on the sideline, particularly if you're officiating in a game and someone's getting really upset. One of the best things you can do from a conflict perspective is get somebody out of the reactive part of their brain and bring them to the, I never say the word properly, so I won't try, but bring them to the part of their brain where they're thinking, they're responding, they're not reacting. And this is something that COVID will help us to do. But naturally, like I think we've sort of already touched around, people have been out of action for so long. It's going to be so difficult for a referee, obviously. There's not a lot of things a referee can do to practice when there's no games for them to practice on. The teams can sort of work up to, doing layups for practice and doing shooting practice. And really, as an official, you can watch some game tape. You may want to read a rule every now and then, or obviously the physical component of things. But acknowledging where the challenges are and will continue to be to get back to where you need to be. But from a conflict perspective, absolutely, you can't allow it to be the excuse. And my tip would be simple: inquire, try and find out why it's happening, and building on how you sort of ended the intro to the connection there is very much say to myself, this can't be the excuse. You can't avoid the conflict because, they could be having problems because of COVID-related things. let's bring that to a head now. Let's try and solve that. And let's try and put them in a place where, again, our culture says to them, it's okay not to be okay, but it's not okay to then treat other people in that way. We need to find a way to solve the actual root of the problem.
Absolutely.
Interesting how this evolves if the vulnerability that has been a little bit exposed here and gives people a new perspective about what's important. Maybe it leads to a more positive attitude and a more open attitude and a more forgiving one that in that way. Again, that was something that came up a few times during the think tanks that we had, that this actually could be in the long run a positive because you get a sense of perspective. One of the phrases that you hear most often says, well, it is what it is, we'll get back and we're just grateful to be playing again, and that kind of thing. So it'd be interesting to see if that does happen.
And I add to that I think that something like this either brings out the best in everyone or it can bring out the worst in a lot of people. But I am mindful that you go through a place like Bunnings or Kmart or any other store, and they've got announcements going over the speakers to say pretty much be polite to the staff, and bad behaviour towards the staff won't be tolerated. That's obviously because this, like we said, sometimes people can actually find this very challenging, and their way of dealing with that is to become a little bit aggressive or push back. But then we've got other people that are just grateful. They'll be so happy to be able to be out and about and to be participating in a sport they love. And I know a lot of people have said to me they can't wait to get back to basketball. And a lot of people have actually said to me that basketball takes them away from their everyday selves, and for them that's good for their health as well, like mentally as well as physically. So I think we'll get a mix of both.
Yeah, I agree, Deb. And again, even building more on that, I was making the joke with someone the other day that I'd be more than happy for someone to yell at me when I'm back at basketball, because I'll just be looking at them and saying, you can yell at me all you like, because I'm so happy I'm back on the basketball court, I'm refereeing, I'm seeing people, play the game that I love being involved in. This is amazing. But I think the big challenge with that is, and why we're talking about this today, is when does that wear off? When does it get to a point where even though if we initially say, oh, let's just not deal with it because COVID's back and everybody's happy, COVID's done, basketball's back and everybody's happy, there's going to become that end to the honeymoon period, for one of different analogies. And we have to be prepared for that now when we go back, before we go back, so that, at no point does somebody, then potentially, if we're talking about a referee, for example, have a bad day at work, losing their job, then go and referee a game of basketball and get abused, and all of a sudden we have an even bigger problem, all prompted because of COVID, but also because they've got to the end of their tether. So I think, exactly what you said, Deb, we're going to have so many referees wanting to referee, so many players wanting to come back, coaches, administrators, everybody's going to be happy. But we need to be conscious that moving forward, there's going to become a time where that joy that is there from missing it is going to elapse, and we need to be strong enough in planning that right now.
And Deb, we do as a sport have a strong policy framework, in member protection policies, which flow down from Sport Australia, from tribunal policies. There's a lot of policies there. But how do we give life to policies? Because policies are just bits of paper that gather dust on a shelf. What are the good basketball associations doing to give that policy life and create a culture that is a positive one, that is one that is focused on solutions, not problems?
We actually only just had a discussion about this today and on the last couple of days, is that we have, and a lot of sports do this, and I have a few people that work here that are from other sports, and they're talking about the conversations they have with people before they enter into a tournament. So they'll have a briefing before they start. And to a certain extent, we do the same thing for our leagues, where we have a discussion with all our supervisors before a league starts, before the season starts across the state, about what our steps and processes and what we would like them to do, so that that document comes to life a little bit more on how it's managed, because everybody has a different interpretation or a different direction they want to go in on how to deal with something. But we wanted some sort of consistent approach, bearing in mind everyone's a little bit different and every situation's a bit different. But we have that meeting with them to talk about, if this occurs, we would like you to do this, and to go through the framework. And one of the things that we've touched on in here from another sport as well is particularly if you've got people lining up and they can't come in, or you want to have a chat to people before they come in. If you've got restricted space and you need to move a whole team out before you bring the next team in, is having that briefing maybe in the foyer or in the just in outside before they come in, to extend that existing briefing we have about behaviour, which we already have, and about if you've got an issue, who you go to. If it's about this, come to this person. If it's about that, go to that person, where the first aid is. This is also about pointing out who the biosecurity person is, and what's expected from behaviour before we start. And that means we're being a little bit more proactive rather than just reacting to something that happens for whatever reason, whether it be to do with COVID or whether it to be to do with frustration about what the officials are calling or what the other team's doing. So we already had that in practice, and a lot of our associations follow that example, and they certainly do it for representative level. But I think a lot of other sports have a similar practice where they might add on to that or tack on some more information that would assist them with managing the venues as well.
And indeed, communicating to people before they get to the venue. There's some changes that you need to be across, whether that's through clubs, if you have a club structure, or upon registration, every individual gets an email back, just giving them that little quick summary, I think can really help.
Always better to do it while they're still happy before they become disenfranchised with something.
Absolutely. So a very simple definition of culture is the behaviours that you accept. Doesn't matter what you write, doesn't matter what you say, the behaviours you accept are the culture that your organisation has. Pete, you're across a lot of different sports. Are there any other learnings from other sports that tackle the issue of culture and do it reasonably well?
There's plenty, I guess. Yeah, to look at it, I always think of culture in terms of habits. So cultures are habits that build up over time and become natural. And what's habits going to do? And Deb made me think about this. That in my work in the complaint handling area in particular, rules and regulations have particular impacts on people in some ways. You get the people who, this is a generalisation, so excuse me, but I'm sure Jack will relate to this. You get people who the rules and regulations are everything, and empathy and culture is nothing compared to the rules and regulations of which you have to go by. And we've got more rules and regulations now than ever before. We've got new ones that people are getting their heads around for the first time ever, that are really bizarre, that we never had anything like it before. So you're going to get those rule evangelists who are going to be there, and that's what has to be done. The people who are successful as MPIOs or in culture know compromise, and they know they have empathy. Those are the people I think really work well and change culture as well, because they can compromise, they can have empathy, they can discuss, they can listen, and do all those skills that are really beneficial, and over time form habits which form culture. Now, if you look at some of the there's some really great CEOs, but some great presidents of clubs too. I can guarantee that they're really good listeners. They're really quite empathetic. They're really good at compromise. They're not bullish in their attitudes. They can be flexible. All those things to me form culture over time, particularly from the top, particularly from leaders. They're leaders who are bullish and aggressive, and we can. I don't want to name any name, but you've seen it in the media in certain sports with leaders being really bullish and aggressive. It doesn't really work in fostering a great culture. And so that flexibility and those sorts of things, if they're habits over time, build a really cooperative and flexible and a positive culture. And I think that's hopefully something that comes out of this. But there's a danger with the new rules and regulations that we have. There's a danger that those leaders who are really bullish or the evangelists of rules and regulations, they'll dominate. And at the moment, that tends to be the white middle-aged males who are doing that. But that's a cultural thing in itself.
So, Jack, to create the positive habits that Peter's talking about means at some point there is going to be behaviour that needs to be confronted, because it's not acceptable. It's not the habit that we want. Whether it's the player yelling at a referee, whether it's a coach yelling at a player, you see a lot of behaviours there that need to be confronted. How do we confront it without ending up in an escalation and an even worse situation?
I think there's two parts to that, Michael. I think The first one is again, you have to recognise it needs to, the point has come to the point where it has to be addressed. That's obviously the first component of that. But then it sort of spins off in two ways. The first one being, and I would say this to any person dealing with conflict, is it's okay to actually accidentally cause that flare up to whatever it may be. There's going to be times where you get it right, and there's going to be times where you get it wrong, both from a conflict, from officiating, from playing, from coaching, whatever it may be. And, you know, let's talk about when you get it right. Well, that's ultimately bliss, right? Everybody's happy, everybody's okay. Even though you've dealt with something that's not necessarily pleasant, people can see where you're coming from. And I'll talk, I guess, a little bit about how I try to achieve that. But I also want to talk about, you know, again, on the similar train of it's okay not to be okay. The reason why people become better at handling conflict is because they've made so many mistakes along their journey that they figure out, oh, I'm not going to press letter A because it caused a disaster. Oh, letter B seemed to get me there a little bit better. So they acknowledge the components they did well. And you know, everybody sitting on the podcast now and those that will listen to it, I'm sure they can think back to many times where they did something that they were like, oh, that strategy worked really well, and another strategy which didn't. So be happy to make mistakes, and not intending to, but be happy when you do and learn the lesson from that, what the mistake was. And I guess for me, the way I try to get it right is my goal, and this is a conflict strategy, but also a learning and development strategy, is I try to get people to get to that spot themselves. So, for example, if I want somebody to see why it's not okay to yell at a referee, instead of coming to them and saying, you are not allowed to yell at a referee, they just get angry, they come straight back with more fire, there's no understanding and there's no value. Whereas if I can have a conversation with them and get them around to the fact that, hey, remember when there was no games during COVID, what's going to happen when no team wants to play because they've got to referee their own duty every week, or their mum or dad has to referee their game every week? Are you going to like that or not? All of a sudden they get to a point, and I remember back to a story very briefly that happened many, many years ago, but I'm having a conversation with somebody who's yelling at the referee, and they're saying, that referee's terrible, this, that, you know, you can join the dots. And I said, that referee's a 12-year-old young girl. How old's your daughter? Oh, she's 12. I said, would you be okay if someone was sitting here yelling at your daughter? Oh, no, that's just the referee. This person in their mind couldn't see the difference between a 12-year-old girl who was wearing a black and white striped shirt, and that was okay to yell at. So I got that person around to a point where they were like, oh, I get it now. I'm yelling at a kid. So when you're able to take people on that journey, that's where you're going to get the most positive culture that you build, because you've learned the lessons from what you didn't get right last time.
Yeah, I think that conversation, as you say, and leading them to a point can be a really powerful strategy. Deb, that's the stick where we have to deal with behaviour. What about the carrot? How can we celebrate good behaviour? How can we celebrate the things we want to become habits in a bid to make them what our habit is? Have you seen anything in associations where they do a celebration, or, and that's probably not quite the right word, but where, you know, they've got to focus on the carrot, on how we promote the behaviour we're after, rather than stopping the behaviour we're not after?
There's to be honest, I actually think that's something we all need to do a little bit more of, because we do a lot, because we are unfortunately in a position where we have to deal with poor behaviour, and it has to be managed. And if it's not going to be us, who is? But I think we do need to try and all of us add more positive reinforcement. And we do spend a lot of time, and I'm sure some of our associations do the same thing, where they, for example, I'll use the under-14s nationals, where we have and some of the other nationals where there's a point system for the spectators that behave well, the coaches that behave well, the great sportsmanship between the players, and they get an award at the end of the week for their positive reinforcement for the week. And I know some associations have similar things, and they'll have a team of the week or a coach of the week, whatever, and they'll promote people that are doing positive things. But I don't think any of us do it enough. I think we need to do it more. We do go and thank people personally for, you know, when people come to us and complain, and Jack will probably be across this, that we've had people come to us at the end of a tournament or a round or games and say, thank you for coming and watching the game. We didn't want to yell, we didn't want to abuse, we didn't want to complain, but we appreciate the fact that somebody obviously noticed there was a bit of a concern. And we thank them for thanking us, because it doesn't happen very often. But I think the same thing happens to them. We don't go and thank them very often for their positive play, their positive reinforcement to the kids, their, the ability to understand that there's, kids refereeing them or referees who haven't got a skill set. We need to do more of that.
And I think, Deb, sometimes people don't understand what is happening behind the scenes. And reflecting on the situation in our Women's National League last season, for the first time, we started to talk to the team coaches about the coaching that the referees received. And it put a different frame on it. The team coaches went, oh, they are accountable. They are being coached. Well, of course, we understand mistakes that happen. Our players make them all the time. So when they had an absence of information, then they just were critical. But when they started to understand, no, there's processes in place, there's things happening, they then were starting to ask, well, can we help? How can we be involved? We want to engage, because we all want the game to be better off in the end.
We have a lot of conversations with coaches about the fact that they feel that officials don't get dealt with because we didn't immediately drop them from the league or take them off a game or discipline them and tell everybody that they were disciplined. Same as for coaches, we don't share what we discipline. We don't share that we've had to address somebody's behaviour from playing or coaching. Same for officials. We don't share that we've done that. And generally it's an education update or additional learning. We're not in a position where we can afford to drop every referee that does something wrong, or we'd have no referees because everyone makes mistakes. But there are quite a few officials in our program who we don't have participating, or we have dropped from certain levels. But because that's not shared, and I think it's when there's a vacuum, then, there's no information there. It's just assumed that nothing happens. But on the other hand, we have a very, very simplistic approach to child protection. I'd say a large percentage of our officials are under the age of 18, and people forget that just because they've got a black and white shirt on, that they're children. And regardless of how poorly they're officiated, as long as they haven't been rude, disrespectful, or deliberately endangering the game, we still need to remember that they're kids, and we need to treat them in a manner that's appropriate for dealing with children in the game.
Absolutely. Pete, have you seen anything across other sports where they acknowledge the good behaviour that they're trying to create?
Yeah, similar to what the guys have been talking about. You made me think of Let Kids Be Kids campaign, and I know you've got the signs up at the stadium, so you've got it there. Let Kids Be Kids, the big lesson for us, which was all about poor sideline behaviour at junior sport, was the voices of kids and the impact on them were extremely powerful there. I've just only a couple of days ago been on a webinar with that featured Sarah Cohn from Swimming New South Wales, and they've gone through a process of meeting and discussing issues with kids in the post-COVID and young people in their sport. What are the issues? How do they feel about some of the actions taken? All those kind of things, and listening to the voices of young people and kids in their sport was tremendously empowering. Not just for the kids, but for the adults as well. And it was extremely powerful to listen to the impact of poor behaviour from the mouths of kids themselves. And that was a huge lesson. So I encourage, wherever possible, it's not an easy thing to do, but wherever possible, listen to the voices of young people in that. What are their concerns? And relay that back. Pull that back into your officials, into your coaches, into your administrators, and say, this is what the impact is. Not from me, not from anyone, not from the boss, not from anybody else. It's from the kids about what's happening, and that's really powerful and can change culture. Yeah,
absolutely. But it's an exciting time across all sports as we get closer and closer to the tip-off or the bounce down or whichever way a game may start. And thank you guys for coming on this podcast. And there's a lot of great tips there for associations, not only in this post-COVID environment, but more importantly, generally in how we create the habits and cultures that are positive and make sport fun for everyone. So thank you for coming on.
Thanks for the invite, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.